Right, so we'll begin. Um, this is definitely a whistle-stop tour of reading 18th century documents. This could take a whole day. This could take a whole week of looking at different formations of words and different letters that you can come across in 18th century documents. So this is very much a starter. And what I'm hoping is that from this, you will be able to um, just have a little bit more confidence in reading 18th century documents, not necessarily quarter sessions records, but any documents from around that time, and go off and do that yourself. And if there's it'll give you a good basis really for reading documents like this in the future. We will be looking at doing other sessions of paleography because this is always really popular. So we'll be looking at maybe how to use title deeds, how to read medieval documents, things like that. So I'm really just going to be focusing on the kind of mid to late 18th century in this session. And it will be very brief, it'll be very quick. But if anyone has any questions, obviously you can ask at the end. Or you can email me if you want to, if you've got any queries. So today we're going to be looking at a brief history of the quarter sessions, the Gloucestershire quarter sessions, just for a little bit of context. And this is really because the June talks from the team at Gloucestershire Archives are looking at unheard voices. And you can find a lot of unheard voices in the quarter sessions because the quarter sessions are voices of people who you wouldn't ordinarily expect to come across in archives because they're not anybody particularly special, they're not necessarily landowners, and you can really get to know some of these people through using the quarter sessions records. So that's the general theme that we are showing today, and really I'm just kind of giving you a bit of context in the quarter sessions. If you want to find out any more about the quarter sessions, you can look at our website or look at Google. So it will just be a very brief history of those. We'll also be looking at the secretary hand alphabet, which is the basis for this talk today. The secretary hand alphabet really stops towards the end of the 18th century, so we're looking at quite late versions of it. But the basis of the alphabet will be a very good way of making you able to read letters into the 18th century and 19th century as well. We'll also look at a few tips and tricks for how to read old handwriting. If you've got any of your own, if you are used to reading it, then please let me know. It's always good to add to my list. And then we'll finish with a few examples of different handwriting in the quarter sessions records. And we will work closely through, I've put 2, but there's actually 3 documents with detailed transcription and interpretation, which I will have done, and I will read out that transcription while we're all looking at the document. I don't know how long that's going to take because this is really for you. So if you've got any questions, we may end up only looking at 1 document. We may end up looking at all 3. So we'll see how we get on. Anybody who signed up before yesterday will have received an email from me, hopefully, with some example documents, which are the ones that we're going to be working through today. But if you didn't receive those or signed up after I sent the email, that's absolutely fine. We're going to be working through all of them if we have time in a lot of detail today. So there's no need for you to have looked at them beforehand. So the Gloucestershire quarter sessions. Basically, these are the predecessor of Gloucestershire County Council. They were all over the country as well. And they were run by men called Justices of the Peace. And you will come across the phrase Justice of the Peace a lot in the quarter sessions records, because every single hearing, every single examination would have been done in front of a Justice of the Peace, who would generally have been the person who wrote the document. They oversaw things like roads, canals, prisons, the police, licensing, weights and measures, lunatic asylums, and many more things as well. And the justices sat at a court called the quarter sessions, which were held 4 times a year, hence the word quarter. And these included hearing criminal cases, which are the things that we are going to be mostly looking through today. Minor crimes were heard at the petty sessions, and the more serious ones were heard by the Assize Court. Most Quarter Sessions records date back to the 16th century, so earlier than what we're going to be looking at today, but into the 18th and 19th century. And the Quarter Sessions themselves date from the 13th century, but don't worry, we're not going to be looking at any of those today, mostly because I can't read Latin, so sorry about that. In the Quarter Sessions, anyone with a grievance could complain about anybody else, no matter their social status. So this is why it's really useful to be looking at Quarter Sessions records. If you have an ancestor who maybe was, as I said, not particularly wealthy or didn't have a particularly interesting job for that time, you might still find things about them in the Quarter Sessions records. So they can be a really good way of finding out a little bit more about your family or the place that they came from. The Gloucestershire Quarter Sessions records represented at Gloucestershire Archives are court records, including order rolls, indictments and depositions, jail records, including calendars of prisoners, police records, including personnel, roads and bridges, electoral registers, enclosure maps, and alehouse licensing records. So it's not just the criminal records that I'm going to be looking at today. Some crimes were treated as felonies in the Quarter Sessions courts. Assault, especially on constables, breaking hedges and fences, burglary, stealing cattle, damaging wagons, carts or ploughs, destroying grain or root crops, highway robbery, horse stealing, manslaughter, murder, poultry stealing, rape, robbing a garden or orchard, sheep stealing, theft of clothes, theft of furniture, or wounding or maiming of cattle. And I must say this is in alphabetical order, so I'm not saying that the things on the previous slide are more important than murder and manslaughter, for example. But it does mean that you'll find a lot of evidence of crimes, as they were at the time, which we wouldn't really see as crimes that would need to be reported or made a big thing of now, such as theft of clothes. You know, I'm sure people would rob other people all the time. So, English handwriting can be quite difficult to read, not just because of the scribe, but also because of the way the words are formed, and also the history of the written language. So until the 14th century, English was only spoken, it wasn't written, apart from very, very rarely. It's an irregular language and it's non-phonetic in spelling. So correct spelling didn't actually exist until the 17th century, which means that you would get a lot of variations of words and lots of variations of letters as well. So within the same document, the same person could spell the same word many different times, which can be quite confusing for us to read them now. But in the 17th century, English spelling did start to be standardised. We will find in the documents that we look at today that quite a lot of the words aren't how we would know them today. And that was going all through into the 17th and the 18th century. Really standardised spelling didn't get into place until the 19th, but it was much better than it would have been before the 17th century. So the secretary alphabet. I have this lovely book here, which I've got a screenshot of on the next slide as well. And this book is a really good kind of beginner's guide of the secretary alphabet. Secretary hand is called that because it was basically the form of handwriting used by English language writers from the 15th to the 17th century, and it was called the secretary hand because most writing was done by professional copyists, so secretaries, clerks, scribes. And it was mostly for legal handwriting, so we'll find it a lot in wills, in inventories, and also in these Quarter Sessions records. Some of the letters in secretary hand have very different shapes from what we're used to today. So this can be a bit confusing, even if you're very familiar with how to read old handwriting. Sometimes the letters can look a bit different and be a bit hard to work out. And I'm saying that through experience. I was transcribing the documents that we're looking at today and had to ask a couple of times from colleagues, you know, what they thought of them. Although much of the 18th century quarter sessions records are easier to read secretary hand, it's useful, as I said before, to have a basic knowledge of the old secretary alphabet, because a lot of these letters can kind of go through into the later handwriting, and it can be quite odd to see them if you don't have that basic knowledge of the secretary alphabet. I've done that slide twice. Okay. Right, so this is the book I was showing you before. This is a Secretary Hand ABC book, and it was published by the Berkshire Family History Society. It's a really good beginner's guide, as I said, in how to read secretary hand, and not least because it's got these lovely pictures of animals and things and how they would have spelt those at the time. So if I was to do a physical document session with you today, I would have asked you at the beginning to write out your own name in secretary hand. And that's a really good way of starting, just to try and work out how the letters were formed. I haven't asked you to do that today, you'll be pleased to hear, but you can have a go after the session if you want to. It's really weird because you think that your name looks like your name. You can probably work out my name's Ali, you can see it's an A and two L's and a Y, but when you start trying to actually read those, write those letters, it can be really odd to try and get used to. So absolutely have a go at writing your own name in secretary hand if you would like to. So here is a very bad copy of the secretary alphabet. There's another slide where I'm going to just break down the letters a little bit more for you. But basically, this is every single letter of the alphabet. And they include capitals and lowercase letters. You can see lots of examples within this of letters that are very kind of flamboyant. So especially at the bottom, which I think was probably just because they thought they would do a little bit more interesting stuff with the letters X, Y, and Z. But you'll get lots of letters that go above and below the lines when you wouldn't expect them to now. You'd get very embellished capital letters like the capital A, which is at the beginning. And things like the D, but I'll show you all this in the next slide. But things like the D's and the capital H's are really quite hard to spot if you haven't got that eye trained in secretary hand. So it's worth always keeping a copy of this alphabet or the secretary handbook or any other thing that you find on the internet if that's easier, just to kind of refer back to. I think that's okay. Sorry, the light went off in the room. Just to sort of refer back to if you're just stuck on any of the letters. So here they all are. This is, in my opinion, what is easy and medium and difficult in terms of what to read. So anything that's got a green heart is, in my opinion, as a practiced reader of old handwriting, is a good thing. So you'll find that the B's, second down on the left, you'll agree they all look like bees. I don't think anyone would disagree with the fact that they all seem to be fairly standard and how we'd know them now. We've also just across from there got the K's, which again you can see all have that sort of K shape, even though they might have a few more little ups and downs on them, they all look like K's. Three down from those, you've got a rather wonderful single N, which is nice to see. They only seem to spell that, write that in one way. And the P's also look okay. Some of the capital P's are again quite embellished, but generally the lowercase ones look like a P and you can work out what it is. And then over on the right, we've got the Y's, which again, I think all look quite like Y's, so that's good. And then the blue question marks are ones that, in my opinion, are a little bit hazy and could be potentially different letters depending on how well they're written. And that often is simply because there's quite a lot of different variations of them. Often you can find all of those variations in the same document. So the A's, for example, at the beginning, all the lowercase a's tend to look like a's, but the capital A's can look quite different. And although once you see that it is meant to be an A, I think you'd agree that if you were looking at some of those A's, you might quickly read them as maybe a D, a lowercase d, or another kind of capital letter. So always worth bearing in mind that things don't always look like how they seem. And then moving on down to the next one is D. The reason I've made D an in-between one is because the top bit of the D can lean over to the left of what you're looking at. So whilst we'd now have it straight up, if it leans over, it could look like part of the word above, for example, or it could look like it's kind of meant to be something else, maybe a blot on the paper, in which case it would just be an O and has something above it. The capital Ds are fairly straightforward, I think you'll agree. Moving on down, we've got the Fs, and the main reason I've highlighted those is because Fs and Ts can often look quite similar because they've both got the cross in the middle of them. So the capital Fs on the right of that, one of them looks like two stuck together, and that is actually a capital F. So quite often you'd have two Fs next to each other, and that means a capital. So you would find that in documents where you'd see kind of two Fs, and that just means a capital F. So again, that can be quite embellished and quite interesting, but once you get your eye in and know that it's definitely an F, it should be quite straightforward to read. And then below that we've got Gs, which again, they all look fairly like Gs, but it may well be that occasionally they can look like Qs, or other letters where the bottom of the letter goes beyond the line. H's can be quite interesting because the lowercase h's go both above and below the line, whereas obviously at the moment in modern writing we would just have it above the line. So you get this kind of cursive H going down below the line, which again could get caught up in a letter below on the line below, which then could get quite mixed up. Or it just doesn't really look like an F, it might look more like a B because it could be quite enclosed, for example. And then a little bit further down, you've got your L's, which look quite straightforward on this secretary hand alphabet, but they can easily get caught up with other letters. So a capital L is quite easy to look at, but actually a lowercase l could end up looking like it's part of a different letter, and then you'd make a whole other letter from it or miss out the L altogether. And then at the top on the third column, we've got your Q's. Again, I've really made those an intermediate difficulty because they can look so like G's, and the capital Q's could look like a capital O, for example. But luckily, you don't find many of those, so it doesn't really matter. And then going down a little bit further, you've got your T's. T's can be quite difficult if you're looking at a copy of old handwriting because quite often the line of the T doesn't actually come across very clearly in the word. So you might think it's an L, or if there's a bit of a pretty thing going on in the line below, it might look like it's going below that line and look more like an F. So just be careful with a T because it could easily be mistaken for a different letter. And then over on the right hand side, you've got your X's, and I've really just made those intermediate because they can so often go down below the line that you might quite easily read them as a P or a W with a little bit of a flourish. So just be careful when you're reading X's, and again, they're not very common, but they can be quite difficult to spot sometimes. I think that's all of the intermediate ones, so I'm now going to move on to the horrible ones. So starting with C, the main problem you find with a C is that a capital C could look easily like a capital O. So, for example, you'll often see the C's a little bit more filled in than they are there. And also the C letter that's on its own, because I took it from a different line, you can see also that the larger square of C's I actually took from the secretary handbook, because it gave examples of what I like to call a hot cross bun C, where you've got the sort of the O shape and then it's got a cross in the middle, and that is a capital C. And you can so easily read that as a completely different letter, an O or a Q or anything like that, that you just have to be really careful, because it looks like really nothing that we use today. And the other thing with the C, which I will show you in more detail later, is a lot of the small C's can actually look like modern day R's. So you'll see it in the larger screen, the larger section of the C's. In the middle of those capital letters, you've got basically just a down line and then an across line, and that is a C. And it's so easy to read those as R's that you can end up getting really baffled by a document because you just don't know what it's meant to say. And especially within names of people and places, it can really trip people up sometimes. And then a couple below, we've got your E's. So the problem with an E is that they look absolutely nothing like our modern day E. It's more like a kind of a little O with a tail. An E doesn't go below the line, but it kind of looks like it's in the wrong part of the line. And then I think you'll agree the capital E's could easily be K's or anything else really. So just be very careful with E's. And again, we'll look at a couple of examples of some E's later where once you know it's an E, you can quite easily spot it in the rest of the document. But until you know, it's quite hard to spot. I've also done a big cross on the I's or J's, mainly because they're interchangeable. So I think you'll agree that these three little I's or J's look like J's, but they're also I's. So just be very careful that, especially in inventories, for example, where you've got item, 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 it might just be shortened to IT, and you can't, it just looks so like a J that it can look really weird at first. So just get your eye in on that. Further down, we've got the O's, which I think it's quite hard to make an O look like something else, but they've managed to make it look like a D quite easily. So just be careful with your capital O's. And quite often the capitals will just look so like other letters that you just need to be careful. Moving on to the R's, mainly highlighted those because although they look like an R, they have like an extra little line, quite a lot of them, the smaller R's, which can make it look like it might be two different letters combined. And quite often they'll make those bigger than they need to be. So just be careful with the R's. The capital R's look okay. My apologies, the two little squiggles at the end of that one are actually parts of the S, so they're not R's, don't worry. Because you'll see them in the S's. They look like how I would write a Z now, and I think some people would be the same as me with that, or some kind of musical notation. So just be careful with that. It would actually be an S, but it might look like it's a symbol. And then you've got some capital S's, which look like they could easily be part of the C's or the O's that we've already looked at. And then you also have the long S's that look like modern day F's, which go both above and beyond, below the line, and can look so like an F or anything else that it's quite difficult to try and work out what they are. And we'll see a couple of examples of those as well. At the end of that S section, you've got ST, so you've got a flowing S, a long S, which joins a T, and that could look like a completely different letter. So just watch out that if there's an S and then a T, it's the long S and then it's joined to the T, and that is seen as one letter, but it's actually the two. moving on to U and W, I'll look at together because they're so similar. I mean, they're similar now, I suppose, because a W is just an extra bit of the U. But just be very careful. Quite often, they'll kind of put extra things on the U's that make them look like W's, or they'll kind of put flourishes on the W's that look like they could be parts of other letters. And a lot of the U's as well look like B's. So you'll see at the end of the U's, there's one that looks basically like a modern day B, just a little bit further over. And that can be quite easy to mistranscribe. You get a lot of upons that look like they are BPON, and that'll be a U, obviously. And then the final one I've really put as a weird one is Z, because for a letter that's rarely used, there are so many different possibilities of what it could look like. And none of them really are the normal modern day Z. A couple of them are the kind of Zs that I do, which maybe some of you do as well. But the normal Z is not really represented in this at all. So luckily, again, they're not really used very much, so you won't come across them. But if you do, they could look like all of those and possibly other versions of it as well. So just be careful. Has anyone got any questions before I move on?
Could I just ask maybe the obvious question, which is why did people who are skilled at handwriting be so inclined to add flourishes to so many letters? Was this because it made the work they'd done for payment, presumably, look worth the money, or was it for some other reason?
I have to say, I don't know the answer to that, but I would imagine that yes, they're kind of trying to show off a little bit and trying to make it show that they're worth the fact that they've been paid to do it. A lot of it would also be kind of line fillers, so they'll feel like they need to use all of the paper or all of the parchment and kind of go, oh well, I've got a bit of space at the end, so I'll kind of elongate this. But no, I don't know why, apart from that it's just a very different way of writing. So it is just more flourishy than it would be now, because we've made it so much more standardized. Does anyone else have any answers to that one?
I think it's job work. I think people who have writing like that were seen as important people, and they would add flourishes to make their job even more special than it. And also, if it had more flourishes and people couldn't read it, then they were keeping themselves in work, weren't they? Perhaps.
And of course, there's the thing as well, from legal documents where people were paid by the word or by the letter, so they would make sure there were as many letters and as many words as there possibly could be, because they were paid for each one of those.
Or could it possibly be where they learned to write? Because friends of mine who went to different schools to me, we all learned to write in a slightly different style. And people producing these documents would have gone to many different schools or private tutors.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I always think, especially at the moment, French people are taught how to write in such a very particular way that you can often tell a French person's handwriting because you know that they've been taught in this kind of very italic, very French way. So yes, it absolutely could be that. Did I see a raised hand from Sally on the screen? Sally, could you unmute yourself? Oh, okay. Sally, you're still on mute, sorry. You can't unmute her, it's not good. Oh.
Sorry.
Sorry.
I wonder if it could be for the personal satisfaction on the part of the scribe that they have their own style and that they get something out of copying quite boring documents at times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so much of the secretary hand is, although there's so many different versions of each letter, there's so much that's very, very standard. And it's not until the 19th century that we really start to see people develop their own style of handwriting. So yeah, I agree. It could be a way of making it a little bit more individual. Yeah, good point. Thank you, Sally. Right, I'm going to move on. I'm just going to whiz through these next slides, just giving you a few examples of peculiarities in spelling, because we'll find loads of them as you work through documents. So these are just a few common ones just to look out for. So you could have an addition or an omission of E or ES. So we'll have loss, obviously with an extra E at the end, friends, it's completely spelt wrong, but you wouldn't put that E in. And then the omission of the E in income or make. And then on the flip side, we've got the consonants often doubled or halved. So we've got always, come, again, but with an extra M instead of a no E, well, or unless. So just ways of reading a word that you wouldn't be used to doing today. And then similarly, we've got the doubling or halving of vowels. So we've got one with an extra O, she with an extra E, gone with an extra O, and three with no extra E, as we would expect now. The interchanging of vowels. So you could have O or OU, meaning would, could, cold, could. That could all be read as two different words. I or IE or Y in place of each other. So you could have first, but you could also have first spelt with a Y, for example. His spelt with a Y instead of an I, and bestow instead of bestow or bestow. And then similarly, you've got the W and the U. So you've got W replacing the U in about, for example, and also U and thousand. So it could just look a bit weird, but once you start putting the words together, it's quite obvious what they are if you haven't been able to work it out. You've also got the changing of consonants, so the addition or removal of a K, for example, in public. C's and T's can be interchangeable, so you've got gracious or gracious. We see it a lot in the quarter sessions with words like suspicious, and words a bit like that, where you would read it as a completely different word until you read it out loud and realise what it should mean. And then you've got lots of words that can be run together or split on the flip side. So you've got the elder or the one, which today obviously we would put a gap in the two words, but back then they would just merge them all together. And then between and allowance, the opposite, making a space where we wouldn't be used to that now. So punctuation or lack of it. Not much use of punctuation in the 16th and 17th centuries. By the time we get to the documents that we're looking at today, this has improved. There is some punctuation, but not the punctuation that we would necessarily expect. So we might see a modern day slash, which could be in place of a full stop or a comma. We could have commas or full stops that we wouldn't put in to a sentence now, but they did, really just because of how it was said rather than how it was meant to be written. We also find a lot of random line fillers, like what we would nowadays put on a check, which would appear at the end of lines. They're not standard, they could be straight, they could be squiggly, they could be long, they could be short, but we do find them quite a lot because a bit like as we would on a check now, they just are there to show that there shouldn't be anything at the end of that line. Nothing's been deliberately erased or anything like that. Minims, my favourite. So we've got quite a few letters that, because of the way they're written in the old style handwriting, basically just up and down with a little bit of a join between them, they are often quite difficult to distinguish if they're in a group because of all of the different vertical strokes that all look the same. So you have to sometimes try various different combinations of letters to produce a word which makes sense and which also fits the context of the document. And also with the old-fashioned spellings, you might have a lot of minims in a word, which isn't spelt like we would spell it today, so we wouldn't expect that many minims in that word. So you just be careful about how things are spelt. And then my favourite example is the one I've put on, which I wrote painstakingly. It takes ages to do that properly. That's minimum. And the only way you can really tell that that's minimum is because I put 2 little dots on what should be the eyes. If those dots weren't there, it would just be a load of lines, and it would be like I'd just done that for ages. So just be careful with that sort of word. You're not going to find the word minimum very much, luckily. So, top tips for difficult letters. Always keep a copy of the alphabet nearby, as I've already said. Either the alphabet that I showed you at the beginning, or the book that I showed you, or just Google if you have the internet nearby and you just want to look something up. It's very helpful in most circumstances. Sometimes it can be a hindrance because it might tell you that something could be a letter and it's actually not, but generally it's very helpful. Remember the fact that some letters look different to how we would expect. So, as I've already said, the old style C looking like a modern R. So this man's name is Thomas Isaac, but it looks like Thomas Isar with an R at the end of the second word. Also, if we wanted to go into that, it could easily be a J at the beginning of that surname. I'm sorry about the quality of that, but it is quite difficult to tell, especially that last name. I and J, as I've already said, are regarded as one letter, so completely interchangeable. N and U can also often be used as the same letter. And some letters like S and R have lots of different forms, which we've already looked at. So loads and loads and loads of very different examples of how a letter should be written. So abbreviations, we have quite a few within 18th century documents, quite a few within legal documents. And these can take various forms. So we've got these nice little, I don't really know what to call it, little wiggly line on top of words. So this could be this generally means it's an omission of an M or an N or some letters within the middle of a word. So the ones at the top, testament, manner, and item, that little line is there to show that an M or an N are missing, and basically you have to try and work out what makes the most sense. And then the omission of the middle letters, again, you have to try and put in a few letters that kind of fit how the word should mean and how it should be taken in context. So this example is letters. I can't see what other word that could be, but there might be some that have different variations that you just have to think, how does this work in this sentence? So we've got abbreviations for per, par, pre and pro, which are all very similar, and they all basically just look like different versions of P's or F's. So we've got provide, so the abbreviation mark for PRO is the first one. Present, so you've got the P with a tiny little superscript R for present. Parish or perish, I don't see any context where either of those could be possible, so just make it fit into whichever one you think is right. And then similarly, the same mark, parson or person, so that could be interchangeable and it could be quite confusing. Just try a few different variations. And then you've got abbreviations of ES, IS and YS. So we've got the two examples, debts and goods. Goods is taken from one of the documents that we'll be looking at. So you've got quite an easily readable good with a thing at the end of it, which is actually an ES. It's not just an S. So that is the abbreviation mark for ES. So you would transcribe that as GOODES. You've also got lots of superscript letters within old handwriting, which you basically just need to practice and be familiar with. So various examples there, Majesty, Lord, Master, Mistress, Pair. Which and with are always very standard. So if it's a CH in the superscript, it's which, and if it's a TH, it's with. So that's always worth remembering. And then aforesaid, tenement and testament, you'll often find the little superscript D, for example, at the end of the word said, and it's actually just an S with a D, and you can make that into a said. And we've also got lots of names which could be abbreviated, which can be really annoying. Quite often, I mean, things like Elizabeth, it's not going to be any different to what we think. So we've got Eliz will often be a way of spelling Elizabeth, or you could add the th onto the end. Quite a lot of times they'll have a colon, which just says this. There should be more after this. So, for example, Henry is quite often spelled H-E-N with a colon, and we've got Thomas as well, and John. So you've got the colon showing that there's more of the name. Most of the time, it's quite obvious what the name should be, but you need to remember also some other ways of spelling names in the 17th century. So, for example, the word Jacob then could be used for James. So just be careful how you would transcribe that. Dates. So I'm not going to spend long on this because it's a bit of a minefield. If anyone's interested, we've got a handbook of dates in the archives by Cheney, which is our little very useful little reference book for working out dates based on things like regnal years. So a lot of documents would say the 10th year of the reign of King George III on this date, or so you'd need to then look at the years in that book and work out what the year would be. You've also got a lot of dates that, particularly with the older records, they would say, you know, the 7th day after Easter in the reign of whoever. So then you would have to look at what those reigning years were, and then work out when Easter was, and then work out the year from that, and the day of the year as well in that case. And then we've got the calendar change in 1752. So before that, New Year's Day was on the 25th of March, and 1752 was the first year that began on the 1st of January. So as a general rule, if the date is between the 1st of January and the 24th of March before 1752, you need to add a year on to the end of the year that you think it is to bring them in line with the modern practice. So a deed of the 20th of February 1745 is actually nowadays the 20th of February 1746. So what we would do in this case is transcribe it as 1745/6, so that anyone looking at the transcription or the catalogue entry or your interpretation of somebody's will, for example, would know that you have taken that into account, that it's actually the year on. So just be aware of that when you're looking at anything before 1752. Just taken a little page from the book here, just to show how they have done the numbers. So you've got the numbers written out, but also kind of minims for the III, IIJ. The J's came at the end of the number. So if it's a 1, then it's just a J. If it's a 2, then it's an IJ. If it's a 3, then it's an IIJ. So it would show that that's the last one. Generally, they're quite easy to work out, but there's just some examples there. So a couple of palaeography tips. If you can't work out a word, leave it, come back to it later. If you're not doing a direct transcription, which quite often you won't be, you might not even need to work out the word anyway. It might make no difference at all to the context of the document. Remember that people's names and names of places may not be spelt the way we know them today. So especially with place names, we'll be looking at one later, hopefully if we have time, which is Wootton under Edge, but they've put all those words together. So it looks like a really long one single word. I say sometimes, but actually often capital letters are not where we would put them nowadays, so that you'll have a lot of capital letters spread out amongst the document, not necessarily in the middle of a word, but certainly at the beginning. And if we don't know that, if we think it should be lowercase, then we might read the word wrong because the capital letter will make it look so different. And this is my favourite tip. Don't be afraid to read out loud. You might not want to be with anybody else when you do so. When I was taught palaeography, I was taught that you would want to read it in the accent of the place that it is written by. So if it's a Gloucestershire document, it's going to be a Gloucestershire accented person writing it down. And so you need to, I'm not going to do it on the screen, but you need to put those kinds of slightly Gloucestershire twangs, I suppose, into the reading aloud. And then suddenly a word might make complete sense, which it didn't before. So a good example, not necessarily for Gloucestershire, is the word for, which could quite often have been read F-O-W-E-R. So you've got for, and that could be a dialect thing. So don't be afraid to read out loud. Once you've roughly transcribed the document, go back to any missing bits, because it might be quite obvious once you've got to the end what that word might be. Again, if you're stuck with a letter, you can't find it in the alphabet, you may find it elsewhere on the document where it makes a lot more sense. So then you realise what it is in the first place. So we're going to look at the first document now. I am going to read this through for you, and as I'm going along, I will point out any of the weirdnesses that we've just talked about. But if anyone has any points that they want to make, please do the raise hand function or pop in the chat, and I'll stop. So we've got Gloucestershire on the left, line 1. You can see that the word Gloucestershire is spelt G-L-O-U, and then kind of a C with a flourish, and then S-H-I-R-E. So that's an abbreviation of Gloucestershire, but quite easy, hopefully, to work out. And then we've got Thomas Isaac of the parish of St Philip and Jacob. So this is our Thomas Isaac that we were looking at before. So we've got the C at the end of his surname that looks like an R. And then we've got the capital I that would look like a modern day J, really more than a capital I. Of the parish of St Philip and Jacob, obviously Jacob is James. And then you've got the saint written with a T as the superscript, so slightly smaller. Moving on to line 2, we've got in the county of Gloucester, blacksmith, maketh oath that. So the C in county is not the kind of way we put a C in now, so it's kind of both above and below the line, lots of little flourishes, and this could be seen now as a capital C. So a little bit different to how we would do it now. Of fairly straightforward, we've got Gloucester. You can see a case here of the C that looks like an R in the middle of that word. We've then got a long S that goes above and below the line. We've got a T that doesn't really look like a T. It could easily be an L. And then at the end, we've got an R that, okay, we know it's an R because it's Gloucester, but you wouldn't write an R like that now. You'd have it as a, the bottom line would be at the top. But because we know that it's Gloucester, obviously it's quite easy to work out. And then blacksmith, again, we've got our C that looks like an R, we've got the S that goes down, and we've got lots of minims after that S, so an M and an I. You can see there are 4 lines, and then the dot on top of the I, which makes it clear that it's an M and then an I, but it could easily be a U and an N, for example. That would look exactly the same, but without the dot. The rest of the line I see as quite straightforward. Maketh oath that. This day, the person now in custody who gives his name. So this is a little bit more difficult, I think. So you've got the S at the end of this, which isn't how we'd write it now. Most of the time, if an S is at the end of the word, it would be that long S. So just be careful with that. It could easily just look like an extra flourish on the end of a word. And then we've got person, which again uses the long S, so isn't immediately recognisable as the word person. Now this is partly because of the copying, but now looks like it could be none, possibly, because we've got the N and then the O, and then we've got something that looks very, very, very like the first N, and then a little flourish at the end. But we know that that's now, because of the context of the rest of the sentence. In custody, we've got the capital C like we had with county, and then we've got the long S again. And this person has very helpfully not crossed his T's sometimes, so that again looks like it could be an L. And then you've got who gives his name, you've got the long S on the end of gives, and you've got the long S on the end of his, which just makes it look a bit different. And then the end of the E on name goes on quite a lot, so it looks different to how we'd write it now. Line 4, we've got to be Samuel Price brought a parcel of iron. So this is where names are often quite difficult. So we can tell that that's probably the word Samuel, because it looks like a Samuel that we would write now. But Price looks quite different. You could make that Peace, you could make that Prior or something like that. We know it's Price because we can see that that C at the end of it is the thing that looks like an R. And this person in this document has been quite standard in the way he writes his C's. So it's quite obvious once you see it that it's Price, but it might just take a little while to get there. Brought, straightforward, a parcel of iron. Parcel, I don't know, that could be barrel, to be honest, if you look at it quickly. So you've got the R and then the C that do look very different, but not like they do in modern words. And then iron, you've got that capital I, again, that could look like a J. Line 5, we've got in a Hempton sack. I'm just going to put my hands up and say, I don't know exactly what that is, but presumably some kind of, the word's gone, sack. You know what I mean? Kind of beige colour sack. To this informant's shop. So you've got here the word informant with the abbreviated TS at the end, which shows that you're missing the A and the N at the end of informant. So a little bit pointless, in my opinion, in this document, because most of the other words are written in full. But it's a clear example of where you could just get really caught out by the fact that the word ends before you think it's going to, and then you've got a weird little thing in the corner which doesn't really look like a TS. Shop and offered to sell the iron for 18p. I think that's all okay, but if anyone has any queries about that, just let me know. And this informant, we've got the superscript T again. Now, I read this word first as supported, possibly other people did. It's suspected, but it looks immediately like supported if you're looking at it without really thinking about it. So you've got the S and then the U, but then you've got the long S and then the P, which could look like it could be a double P or something. And then, of course, you've got the C as well that shows it's suspected. The same iron to be stolen goods, and goods is the word I showed you earlier with the ES mark showing that it's that it just means goods. He sees the same and carried the said prisoner to be taken into custody. So in the middle of the line here, we've got the word said, where you've got a normal S and then a superscript D, which shows that there should be other letters in between. Sorry, I've read that wrong. It's caused the said rather than carried the said. So that's CAUSED on the third word of that line. Again, the long S caught me out anyway when I was just reading that. Line 9, you've got upon suspicion of stealing the same, and suspicion is here showing an example of the abbreviation mark that shows that there should be something else there. In this case, it's an I. Again, I just would have written that I, but that's fine. You know, this is 1736, so they could do what they wanted. But you've got, again, the long S, the P, I, C, I, O, N, so slightly different to how we'd expect to see it. And then at the end of the line, and the same sack and iron now produced. Fairly straightforward, I hope. Just not a very good copy. And then you've got a bracket, which is exciting. So you've got which the said prisoner now says he brought from some outhouse belonging to Robert Wells of Mangotsfield, and that's the brackets, that's the whole bracket. So they look just like lines, they are actually brackets. So the prisoner is saying this. So they're really using a bracket like we would nowadays. Robert Wells, you just need to be careful, particularly of the surname, just making sure that you're not saying his name is Robert Walls or anything with a Y at the end, for example, because it could look like that with the long S. And then Mangotsfield, I think is spelt wrong. I imagine it should be an I before the E, but it's quite easy to read that word, especially if you know Gloucestershire places. So that's quite straightforward. And then to finish, are the same that this informant seized as aforesaid. So again, you've got the abbreviation in informant, and then you've got the abbreviation at the end of aforesaid with the little d. You've then got the mark of Thomas Isaac. You'll find this a lot because people couldn't write for themselves. All they could do was do a cross. So they would be there when it's being written and then just cross to say that that's what they think. And then you've got the little bit at the bottom. Now I had one person, I think it was Andrew, who came back to me and said it's often quite difficult to read the beginning and the ends of things like this because they're not kind of telling a story necessarily. They're almost just words in themselves. So this is sworn before me, one of His Majesty's Justice of the Peace, for the said county, the 22nd of May 1736. So he's very helpfully provided the full date, which is great. We don't need to try and work that out. And this man's name is Henry Cheswick, I think. So that's Cheswicke. But maybe some of these names, it would be necessary to just look up on Ancestry or something similar, just to try and work out exactly what it would be. But this is a very common abbreviation of Henry. So that's document 1, 1736. Now, we are officially out of time. If anyone wants to go, please do. I'm very, very happy for that. I will just look at the next document as well if anyone wants to stay for that. I'll just pause now in case if anyone does have to go and wants to ask any questions before they do.
Yes, Ali, thank you very much. So I've got to go now. Can I just ask one question about the third document?
Yes.
And that is, sorry, not that one, the next one. I thought that one there. I couldn't understand this document with the spacing. They seem to space it out very nicely, and then down the bottom of the evidence, they've squeezed in 2 or 3 lines all together. Yeah. I just wonder whether that was because they'd already got the bottom part written out.
That is probably the case. Yes, to be honest, I hadn't even noticed that. But yes, it does look like they've kind of started off quite normally, and then realised that they're running out of space. And of course, it doesn't help as well that they've got a little inserted bit in the second to last line, which just makes it even more squeezed. So yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're probably right there. So they'd already done the sworn this day and year, and just needed to fit everything else in. Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks very much today. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Has anyone else got any questions about the first document before I move on? No, perfect. So this document is from slightly later. This is from 1750. And this is interesting for many reasons, but mostly because this is a woman who is being asked to give her information, which is not massively problematic because lots of women were, but she signed her name at the end. She didn't use a cross, so you can see that her name at the end, Ruth Hyde, is actually written out by her. So that suggests an unusual level of education for a woman at this time. So if you are looking at quite a few of these sorts of documents, if this does happen, woman or man, actually, it's always quite interesting if they can write their own name, until the end of the 18th century because it was just so uncommon. So at the beginning, we've got Gloucestershire again with the abbreviation in the middle. To wit is kind of self-explanatory. The information of Ruth, the wife of Nathaniel Hyde of the parish of Rodborough. Now, I first read the surname as Guide, G-Y-D-E. It is Hyde because it looks more like Hyde later. But this is an example of a word where it could look very different in different parts of the document. And as it goes on, you might well change the spelling of it as you learn more. In the said county, cloth worker. The jobs are always quite interesting because a lot of them aren't ones that we would know commonly today. So you might have to work out quite a few of them quite painstakingly. This one is quite hard to work out as a cloth worker until you know that the first letter is a capital C, really. And then you can kind of piece together all of the other letters. Taken upon her oath before me. Fairly straightforward, I think. And then you've got an open bracket again, which I don't think in this document actually ever closes. So we've got one of His Majesty's Justices of the Peace for the County of Gloucester aforesaid, the 13th day of October 1750. So he doesn't say who he is, although we do find that out later. And again, nicely for us, he gives us the whole date. For those of you who got the documents that I sent out yesterday, the third one doesn't say the year. You do have to work it out, I think. And it was 1766, but it just said it was in the 6th year of King George III's reign. So sometimes you do have to try and do a bit of research. Who saith that on Thursday last past, I'm just going to find my transcription. Being the 11th instant between 10 and 11 of the clock in the forenoon. So we've got an old-fashioned way of saying the time. We've got this capital C that keeps going across this document, which can look quite confusing because it's not commonly a capital C that we would use for it. She locked the dwelling house door and went a little distant from the house to a pump. Now, so on line 11, we've got an example of where you've got two words that are combined into one. So it's spelt Thouse, but it's saying the house. So they're saying house, but it means the house. And you can work that out from the context of the document. So she goes to a pump to fetch a pail of water. Pail is quite hard to read in this particular document because you've got the capital P again. This person puts capitals in all over the place, and then you've got the A and then LE, but because the E is not a recognisable E, it could be a B potentially. You know, it could be various things until you realise, probably when you then read of water, that it's a pail of water. So again, keep the context in mind. And when she came back and unlocked her said door, so the word unlocked is spelt Unlockt, so it's pronounced the same but spelt differently, so could trip you up there. She observed a cagement open and one of the window bars taken out. Now, this is, I think, meant to be spelt cagement, but it means casement. I see it as cagement, but to be honest, the quality of the document, it could easily be a very weird way of writing an S. In context, again, it is clearly casement, it means casement window. But it looks like it could be a Z or a Q or something like that, or indeed a G. And one of the window bars taken out, and immediately she saw one William Cooper of the said parish of Rodborough. The only thing to say about that is that the word immediately in the middle of line 14 is spelt with only one M. So just be aware that that's a letter removed, which could, if you are going through that word letter by letter, could be quite hard to work out the rest of the word if you're not sure what the other letters are. William Cooper, quite nicely written. It's quite obvious what his surname is, which is useful. Of the said parish of Rodborough, labourer, quite a common job, so quite easy to spot. Creeping out of the said window. Again, you've got the capital C, which is just coming up everywhere in this document. And then we've got a comma, which is great. We like commas. When this informant endeavoured to apprehend him, comma again, but he told her he had not taken anything out of her house, and immediately escaped from her this informant. So we've got a capital H for house, but apart from that, it's spelt right. We've got the immediately with only the one M again. And we've got a capital I for informant that looks like it could be one of the C's that I mentioned before. It's not as big an I as we've read elsewhere, so just be careful with that. But upon opening her boxes, she had lost a silk handkerchief, which she has reason to believe the said William Cooper had stolen. Now, in this document on your screens, I don't think that'll be very easy to read, but if you do look at the document itself with a magnifying glass, you can work out what those words should be. They're just very bunched together, but otherwise well written. So just look at things very, very carefully if things are kind of all mixed up like that. And the word she is inserted into the line, which makes it even smaller, which is really annoying. You've also got an abbreviation of William in the last line. So you've got W-I-double-L and then an M, which is superscript. So that's one of the key abbreviations of William to look out for. And the only problem really with this document, once you've got the hang of the letters, is the fact that a lot of the words are quite bunched together, especially those last couple of lines. So just be careful with that. You've also got the line filler at the end of that last line after stolen, that shows there's nothing more to say. And then you've got her signature, Ruth Hyde, and then sworn this day and year first above written before me, S. Hawker. So that's what his name is. It took me a while to work that out because the W doesn't really look like a W, but that is his name. And the useful thing about the Justice of the Peace is that he will be in future documents. So if it's not very clear in this one, hopefully it'll be more clear in future ones. So we've come to the end of that document. If anyone wants me to send any other examples of quarter sessions documents that you want to have a go at transcribing and send back to me, I'd be very happy to do that. So if you just send me an email via the archives account, if you do want to have a go at any of these and just check that you're doing it right, I'd be very happy to cast my eye over it and send you some useful examples of different kinds of handwriting. Different people had different styles even at this time, so it's quite useful to work through a lot of different things, even if it was all at the same time, just to see variations in spellings of letters and things like that. But for the time being, we've run out of time, so thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, I'm very happy to stick around. I'll turn the recording off now and just answer those questions for you if you did want to hang around and ask anything. But in the meantime, thank you very much for coming, and I hope it's been useful for you. And please all go off and read. Oh, thank you. Yes, I have a question. Yeah, read more quarter sessions documents and just keep your hand in. It's a really fun thing to practice. So yeah. Right, in answer to Janet's question, yes, I do, but I don't have them with me. I've got a really useful reading list, which I can send out to everybody. So I will send that out as an email to all attendees, kind of further reading, which hopefully will be very useful to everybody.